morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you, as always, for your ongoing viewership and support. We have scheduled a number of in-person member events beginning this week, so be sure to check out our website and sign up. In addition, we will be resuming our in-person events for the public after Labor Day. And an important news for this audience is that we will continue to have Dan's weekly live streams ongoing, and he's also agreed to do a few in-person events starting in the fall as well. So there'll be more Dan than ever before. And with that, let me bring Dan on because he has three fabulous topics for this week's program. I know that we didn't get to the critical race theory last week, so that's the top of Dan's list. What is critical race theory and why does it matter? The second item is getting out of Afghanistan, what happens next? And third, Biden steps up the push for COVID-19 vaccinations. Never a dull moment with your program, Stan.
Well, thank you so much, Kim. Although the phrase more Dan than ever before sounds a little bit like a threat. So we need to calm people down by the time this is all over today. But I'm looking forward to today's discussion. And I want to apologize for those of you who tuned in last week, specifically looking forward to the conversation about critical race theory. And as I mentioned at the time, I think what I judged as we were going through the first two topics, that this is such an important subject, I didn't want to rush through it at the end in order to get to our questions. So we are going to spend more time on this topic today, both as part of my initial presentation and then hopefully as part of your questions when Jessica joins us at the bottom of the hour for the second half of the program. So that said, topic number one, what is critical race theory and how should history be taught? Now, when we'd originally planned to talk about this last Tuesday, it seemed to me that the timing was really good because many of us had just come off of the 4th of July. Had just come off of the 4th of July weekend. And so many of us had just spent the weekend commemorating our nation's founding. So it seemed like a very appropriate opportunity to talk about how we teach our nation's history to our young people. But not surprisingly, the debate over critical race theory has not been settled since last Tuesday. And questions of what history and whose history should be taught is about to become much more contentious and much more politicized. So let's start out by defining our terms, because the phrase critical race theory has been thrown around quite a bit lately. The most important point, as I see it, is that the theory's supporters argue that racism is not personal, but structural. And this is a really important point. Racism is not personal, it's structural. It's not an individual making decisions to demonstrate bias or prejudice or hate towards someone from another group or another community, but rather it's something that's hard baked into our system, into our structure in this country. Now, critical race theorists say that the mainstream understanding that racism is an individual prejudice and choice is wrong. The common assumption is that most people are free of bias and racism, so that racism is an exception from the norm for particular individuals. And therefore, the idea in common thinking is that racism can be addressed by individual measures, such as calling someone out or sometimes punishing someone who voices or acts in a racist or sexist way, and then enforcing those moral codes, but at an individual level. And I'll admit that this is the way I've always thought about questions of bias and prejudice. Individual bad actors acting outside of societal and cultural norms. But critical race theory says that racism is inherent in our institutions and our structures of governance. In other words, racism is ordinary, not unusual, and it's integrated into our consciousness in complex ways through our education, government, media, and our participation in any other number of societal and structural systems. The theory argues that racism must be addressed not just by punishing individuals, but by challenging and reforming these types of education and government and media structures. So the basic question, and I'll warn you in advance, the horribly oversimplified question, is whether racism is the exception or the rule. And where the discussion gets even more polarizing is on the practical application of those two theories. On one side, there are those who would literally whitewash American history, returning to a time in which injustices against women and minorities and other marginalized communities were pretty much ignored in most classrooms. On the other side, on the other extreme, are the voices who believe that the United States has been an inherently racist system from its inception, and because of that, our children should be taught history through that very accusatory and potentially divisive prism. So two really big, very extreme ideas here on how to teach history to young people. And so Claire, if we can, let's put the question up for our group here today and see what they think. How do you believe American history should be taught? One, do you believe that there should be a strong emphasis on our nation's past racist actions and sentiments? Do you believe that there should be some emphasis on those past racist actions and sentiments, but not dominating the historical discussion? Do you think there should be a slight emphasis on the nation's past racist actions and sentiments so that they're acknowledged, but really don't detract from the overall, from the overview of American history? Or finally, do you think there should be no discussion of these actions and sentiments, and that American history should be taught in an extremely uplifting and overwhelmingly positive manner? A tough question, I'll admit, but I'll be very eager to see what all of you have to say on it. And wow, look at that, very interesting. 64%, almost 2/3 of you, believe there should be some emphasis on the nation's past racist actions and sentiments, but that it should neither be an overwhelming, a strong emphasis, nor should it be a slight or no emphasis. If you add up those first two categories, 93% of you believe that it is something that does need to be emphasized to a great degree, whether some emphasis or strong. Only 6% say there should be a slight emphasis, and no one at all, not surprisingly, said that we shouldn't talk about those things at all. Very interesting responses. And let's move on, and I'm going to be eager to come back to you in just a minute with another question on this topic as well. My own opinion, for what it's worth, is that there's a logical middle ground to be had in which students are taught about both the positive and negative aspects of hundreds of years of a country's existence. I don't see any reason why we can't construct a syllabus that addresses both the Emancipation Proclamation and Juneteenth, both the Tulsa Massacre and the Freedom Riders, both Nathan Bedford Forrest and Martin Luther King. We ought to be able to do both. It seems to me that it ought to be possible to teach about racist and sexist behavior without rejecting an entire society as racist or sexist. But right now, what we hear mostly are these false choices, or what I would consider to be false choices anyway. The current political landscape makes the discussion on these topics even harder. After the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor last year, there seemed to be a brief unifying moment where a racial reckoning of some sort was beginning to take place in this country. But as most of you remember, that quickly gave way to a very polarizing debate over public safety and police reform that ultimately left the country even more divided. And I worry that the argument over critical race theory seems destined to end up in the same place. Now, one side calls for a curriculum based on the New York Times 1619 project. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the Times 2 years ago released a very comprehensive study which commemorated the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in colonial Virginia in the year 1619, and suggested that this event was the actual starting point for the American historical narrative, as opposed to either the Pilgrims arriving, the Declaration of Independence, or the Revolutionary War. Their opponents countered the 1619 project with what they called the 1776 Commission, which was established by President Trump to design a more traditional program of study that emphasized the more inspirational aspects of the nation's birth and our growth. Now, in an ideal world, as I was saying a minute ago, our children would learn about both. Assumptions that every white American is either irredeemably racist or completely blameless as the two extremes ought to leave a lot of space in the middle ground for reasoned and respectful dialogue. But I worry that absolutists on both extremes will continue to drown out those discussions. Now, some of you may remember George Orwell's famous maxim from his book 1984. And in 1984, Orwell wrote, quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past," unquote. And that's what's going on here. Both sides passionately believe that their respective versions of the past are entirely, completely accurate. And so both sides want complete control over what's taught to our children in the present, because of course that will determine what today's students will believe in the future when they move into positions of leadership. That's why compromise is going to be so difficult. And that's why this fight is going to be with us for a while. And something tells me that we haven't talked about it for the last time. But before I move on to the second topic, I'd like to ask you another question. Claire, can we put up question number 2? We talked about what the makeup of US history ought to be, at least as it relates to questions of racism and discrimination. Question here is, who should be making this decision? Who should be deciding how US history is taught? Should it be teachers? Should it be school administrators, principals, and superintendents? Should it be parents? Should it be local elected officials, such as school board members? Or should it be state and national elected officials? And you can argue that more than one and maybe all of these entities has some say in the process. But let's think about who ought to have the most preeminent voice of these 5 options. Let's see what our group had to say, Claire. Look at that. 33%, 1/3 say teachers, but almost identical 1/3, 34%, say that our state and national elected officials, legislators, members of Congress, and so on, ought to be making these decisions. Local elected officials, such as school board members and school administrators, came in a little bit lower at 14 and 13%. Only 7% think parents ought to be making those decisions. So once again, it's a topic I know we'll come back to in the future, but to me at least, this is a really interesting starting point, finding out where all of you come down on such important topics. So let's move on. Let's move on to our second topic, and that is the US pullout of Afghanistan after almost 20 years of fighting a war in that country, the longest war in American history. So just yesterday, the top US general in Afghanistan stepped down from his command, and that marked not an official, but a symbolic end to 20 years of American military involvement in that country. And this comes just a few days after President Biden said that the full drawdown of forces would be complete by the end of August. And when Biden spoke last Thursday, he said he believed the US mission had been accomplished following the dismantling of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and the killing of Osama bin Laden. Now, just to go back a little bit, Donald Trump had promised in his administration's negotiations last year with the Afghan government and the Taliban, Trump had promised the Taliban that at that point, the 3,500 US troops that were still in Afghanistan would leave the country by May 1st of this year. And in exchange for Trump's promise to leave on May 1st, 2021, the Taliban made two promises. Number one, they promised not to attack Americans. And number two, they promised to engage in serious peace talks. And let's agree that they kept the first promise. No American has died in combat in Afghanistan in about a year and a half. But they broke the second promise because there really haven't been serious peace talks that have taken place since then. So where that left Biden was with the following choice. Should he either maintain the US troop presence, which would almost certainly have prompted Taliban attacks, or to complete the withdrawal? So Biden decided to make good on the pledge that he made during his campaign to end the war that he has viewed for many, many years as unwinnable. But Biden's decision also recognizes the way politics in America are changing as it relates to sending our troops abroad for military intervention in other countries. Now, most national polls show that a majority of Americans support Biden's decision to pull out. And even many Republicans, including Trump, who pushed for the drawdown himself, as I mentioned, are supportive of a withdrawal. And most Americans, given COVID and economic worries and other more close to home concerns, are just not paying a lot of attention to a conflict in Afghanistan that they've been ignoring for many, many years. So that's what the nation thinks. Most American voters think that the pullout was the right thing to do. What do you think? Claire, can we post the third question for our group? Excuse me. So how do you feel about Biden's decision to pull out of Afghanistan? Option one, it was the right thing to do at the right time. Number two, it was the right thing, but it was long overdue. It should have been done years ago. Option three, no, it was the wrong thing to do. US troops need to stay to protect the country. Or finally, it was the right move, but we should have coordinated better with our allies, with NATO, and with the Afghan government and military. So let's see how this came out. What you thought about this important question? Wow, very interesting. All but 6% of you believe that we should be out of Afghanistan. 34%, roughly a third, said it's something that should have been done previously. 9% said simply it was the right thing to do at the right time. More than half said it was the right thing, but we should have coordinated it better. And there were numerous stories, numerous news articles about how the changeover was not as smooth as either NATO or the Afghans would have liked. And only 6% say that US troops should still be staying in Afghanistan to protect that country. So now let's talk about this. Let's talk about the threat to Afghanistan for a few minutes. Biden has not conceded that the Taliban would fully take over the country, even though they've seized dozens of Afghan districts across the country. Biden's pointed out that the US has helped train hundreds of thousands of Afghan troops to help them be prepared for this moment where they defend their country on their own behalf without outside help, without nearly as much outside help. But General Austin Scott Miller, who stepped down from his command yesterday, and who is the longest serving US commander throughout our military involvement in Afghanistan, General Miller has repeatedly voiced concern about the pace of the Taliban's territorial gains. And he has worried out loud and publicly about the potential for civil war in the country once the US military is left. The Afghan military is mostly funded by the United States and NATO, and they've been putting up resistance in some parts of the country. But overwhelmingly, Afghan government troops look like they've simply abandoned the fight. In recent weeks, the Taliban has gained control of several key strategic districts and regional capitals, and particularly gained control along the borders with neighboring countries. And so those countries that are adjacent to Afghanistan, most notably Iran and Pakistan, are getting very, very nervous at what they see as a potential overwhelming flow of refugees across the border into their countries and possible lack of stability in Afghanistan, which could spread throughout the region as well. Now, Afghanistan officials say that the US and NATO withdrawal has left a vacuum and that they're struggling to defend their country because what they have right now are security forces, they say, stranded on the battlefield without resupplies, sometimes running out of food and ammunition, and not having US or Western allies there to help support them. So the Taliban at this point control just over 1/3 of the country. And the US intelligence community concluded last week that the government of Afghanistan could collapse as soon as 6 months after the US military withdrawal from the country is complete. And that's in contradiction to what President Biden has said. One of the reasons that the Taliban has progressed so quickly is they haven't had to do nearly as much fighting as either side had anticipated. What's happening instead is local politicians and tribal elders around the country are negotiating surrender agreements with the Taliban in order to avoid the fight that they don't think that they can win. And as a result, more and more of the Afghan military troops are simply surrendering. Many of them haven't been paid for months, and they've been leaving armored vehicles and weaponry and artillery, mortars and heavy machine guns to the Taliban in exchange for safe passage either to their homes or out of the country. Now, the US intelligence experts I mentioned a moment ago believed that the government originally thought the government could survive for as long as 2 years once the US withdrawal is completed. And I'll just note that that's about the same interval that elapsed between the US withdrawal from Vietnam in the 1970s and the fall of Saigon in April of 1975. Now, the more recent view, as I said earlier, of US intelligence is that the government of Afghanistan could fall between 6 and 12 months after American troops depart. And other Western officials believe that the collapse could come within 3 months. So I want to get back to the reference I made a moment ago to the Vietnam War. So after the fall of South Vietnam in 1975, there was an immense and very bitter debate over who lost the Vietnam War. And Afghanistan isn't lost, at least not yet. But with the Taliban advancing so rapidly, the debate over who lost Afghanistan has already begun, and it's beginning to sound a lot like the who lost Vietnam argument that took place a generation ago. Republicans are blaming Biden for what they call a disaster in the making. But of course, they were ignoring that it was Trump who began the withdrawal. Biden, as I said earlier, defended himself last week by saying that the US had achieved our objectives. He said, to get the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11 and deliver justice to Osama bin Laden. And then Biden said, it's up to the people of Afghanistan to decide on what government they want. So let's just agree, there's plenty of blame to go around for what's likely to be remembered in history as the second major war after Vietnam that the United States has lost. My own opinion is that the real blame falls on politicians and generals of both countries, of both the United States and Afghanistan. A succession of US presidents have made very bad mistakes, one right after the other. I believe that George W. Bush was right to go into Afghanistan after 9/11, but most Americans believe he was wrong to shift our country's focus from Afghanistan to what many consider to be a war of choice in Iraq. Barack Obama did implement a troop surge under pressure from his generals, but a lot of people saw it as sort of a half-hearted surge. And because Obama, if you remember, put a time limit on the increase in troops that he would send to Afghanistan, the argument is that all Obama was doing was encouraging the Taliban to wait it out. Trump, as we talked about earlier, negotiated an agreement with the Taliban, but one that really asked for almost nothing in return for a US pullout. And then Biden, instead of pointing out that the Taliban had failed to break ties with al-Qaeda, is now moving ahead with the withdrawal, even though Afghanistan is almost certain to become a terrorist haven again. But the military shouldn't escape blame for this either. Our US forces were in that country for almost 20 years and simply were not able to build a competent Afghan army and police force, nor, as was the case in Vietnam, were they willing to tell the truth about how badly the war was going. I would say that along with US politicians and military leaders, the Afghan political and military leaders have been much, much worse. The reasons that so much of the Afghan army appears to be crumbling in the face of the enemy, just as the Iraqi army did in 2014, are poor leadership and pervasive corruption. And even now, with the enemy figuratively and often literally at the gates, the Afghan elite, both political and military, are still just squabbling amongst themselves rather than trying to unite to save their nation. And I'd say that given the dysfunction and the corruption of the Afghani leadership, it is tempting to simply wash our hands of the country, as Biden is now doing, by suggesting that we've done enough and now it's up to them. And there is a logic to this argument. But in Afghanistan, I think it's important to remember that the United States is complicit in the misgovernance, just like we were in South Vietnam. For 20 years, we have pumped billions of dollars into Afghanistan. And a lot of that money has been spent cutting deals with corrupt warlords to take our side against the Taliban. But what we did is in the process, we empowered terrorists and at the same time made the Afghan military completely reliant on our support. And so by leaving, we're not giving the people of Afghanistan the opportunity to decide how they want to be governed, as Biden had said. All we're doing is giving the Taliban, a group of terrorists, the opportunity to oppress the people of that country. Now, that's not an argument for staying, because very smart people and any number of military experts have argued that no matter how long the US or outside forces stay in Afghanistan, that the type of success that was defined back in 2001 is simply never achievable. The Russians learned this. Back in his day, Alexander the Great learned this. And now the United States has learned this. The old saying is that Afghanistan is the graveyard of empires. And while staying longer would not necessarily have achieved additional security goals, the point to be debated, if you like, for certain, there's no question that this never-ending series of mistakes by both countries' leaders has left us in a no-win situation. And while the country is not unanimous, but largely in support of President Biden's decision to leave, I think we do have to recognize the wreckage that we're leaving behind, and to a large degree are something for which we are very responsible. For the second consecutive week, I've taken more time than I anticipated on my first two topics, but I hope you'd agree that talking critical race theory and the incredible complexities of Afghanistan politics and geopolitics were worth going on a little bit longer. So we'll make sure that one of our three topics for next week will be the latest in the fight against COVID, and what the Biden administration is attempting to do in order to escalate that fight. But we'll set that aside for now. And Jessica, if you're willing to join me, well, there you are. Let's see what our group wants to talk about. And as always, we'll do our best to address your questions and your concerns.
Thank you so much, Dan. Before we launch into the Q&A session, I just wanted to thank our viewers for your continued support. As you know, we depend on your donations to cover our expenses so that we can continue to bring you these important discussions. So if you are able to make a donation, please go to our website at lawacth.org and click on the donate button. We greatly appreciate your support. Thank you so much. All right, so we had a couple of questions from last week that I did hold on to for this week. The first question, is the recent focus on critical race theory a legitimate concern, a pushback by those who believe the term white privilege is divisive, that it defines people by color, or are overwhelmed by excessive emails and required meetings that potentially prevents critical work from being done, spin from the right to fire up its base, or the rise of white supremacy in our society with its messages filtering into politics?
So it's only just desserts that I get asked a multiple choice question after putting them to all of you each week. Jessica, can you repeat the last of the options that the questioner listed?
Sure. So is it people are overwhelmed by excessive emails and required meetings that potentially prevents critical work from being done, spin from the right to fire up its base, or the rise of white supremacy in our society with its messages filtering into politics?
Well, I would offer another alternative. And the alternative I would offer is that our country, as I mentioned in the first part of the program, but you didn't need to hear it from me, this country, our society, is still struggling with the legacy of racism. There's no question that American history and world history, I think it's important to remember that this country is not unique in this regard. Over the existence of humankind is replete with examples of some groups of individuals subjugating others. And whether it's through prejudice, whether it's through bias, whether it's through discrimination, whether it's through slavery, that's not unique to the American experience. And the struggle here is we have to decide for ourselves not whether or not to talk about those types of behavior and those types of reprehensible actions. Not whether to talk about them because we need to, but first how we talk about them. And number two, this is going to sound a little bit unfeeling and I apologize in advance, how much we talk about them. Because I think most of us would agree that the United States is not a perfect country with a perfect history. But I think that most of us would also agree that we are a country which has accomplished a lot of very admirable things over the course of our existence. So the question is, how do you balance the good and the bad? And I don't think there is a good answer for that. So the debate over critical race theory, on one hand, does lend itself to a handy political fight heading into a critical midterm election year. But at its core is a very basic question about how do you teach young people both about a country's faults and its successes? And one of the reasons that this fight is so inflammatory is, number one, we don't have consensus on an answer. And as I said earlier, the strongest and most insistent voices on both extremes are so loud and so committed to their version of the truth that it makes it harder for those of us who do want to try to establish a reasonable common ground. It makes it much more difficult for us to be heard. So knowing that this is an issue that's going to inflame political debate for the foreseeable future, my hope is that once things calm down to some degree, that we can reach a reasonable consensus in a reasonable middle, in which we can say this country has achieved great things. This country and its people have achieved great things, but we've done some really bad things and made some really bad mistakes along the way too. And the calibration of that is, I don't think, ever going to reach a final conclusion, but it's an ongoing discussion and debate which has the best chance of being successful when people are willing to acknowledge that the answer does lie somewhere in the middle rather than on one extreme or the other.
According to a recent Economist/YouGov poll, the majority of those polled have an unfavorable view of critical race theory and see it as bad for America. Shouldn't voters, through state legislatures, get to determine the curriculum for students?
Well, I think the question is a fascinating one, and I would actually expand the question beyond critical race theory, not just who should decide whether the history of race relations and discrimination is taught in our schools, but who should decide what the curriculum in our schools should be more generally. Who makes those decisions? Should teachers make those decisions for themselves? Should their principals and superintendents? Should elected school boards? Should state and local elected officials? State and national elected officials? Or should parents? In my own opinion, just like the previous question, is it needs to be a collective effort. No one has a monopoly on the wisdom of deciding what our school children should learn and what they should not. Ultimately, it's the teacher's responsibility to oversee the classroom. And so I think it is critically important for the teachers to have a role in that discussion. But I would argue strongly, and I was somewhat surprised not to see larger numbers on this option. I think it's critically important that parents get involved in that discussion too. And I think ultimately the best decision making when it comes to schools on any subject, whether it's critical race theory, whether it's reopening after COVID, whether it's student testing, whether it's teacher hiring and firing, ultimately we need to hear from the people who are doing the work every day, the teachers and the administrators. We do need to rely on policymakers who have the ability to take a step back from that day-to-day challenge and look at these questions in a broader context. But I think it's absolutely critical that the parents of these children be given a voice in this discussion too. So I'll acknowledge freely that I'm dodging the questioner, but I'm not ignoring the question. I'm simply saying the critical race theory is one of dozens, if not hundreds, of extremely important decisions that need to be made every day about our children's education. And the more stakeholders who are involved in those discussions, the more likely we are to get to an outcome that reflects the goals of the community.
How is the curriculum shaped to empower children and not create more division? Does focusing on racism breed more racism? Given that they are kids and not responsible for what happened in the past, would instead focusing on kindness and mutual respect with different people be a better way for children to grow into kind, respectful adults?
I happen to think so. I happen to think the questioner's suggestion is the right one. I'll admit, until I began reading up on critical race theory over the last several months, it had never occurred to me, as I mentioned earlier, that there were those who thought that racism was a structural rather than an individual act. And I thought, as I'd mentioned earlier, that individuals, men and women, came to decisions about discrimination and bias, with which I would, in all likelihood, not agree, nor of which I would approve, but that rectifying those mistakes takes place on an individual basis as well. And I think the best way to prevent those attitudes from arising is to give young children a chance to get to know and to work with and to play with children from other backgrounds, from other perspectives. And despite many people's best efforts, to some degree, that attitudinal shift is happening on the natural. On issues like immigration policy, on issues like marriage equality, we're seeing that young people, both liberal and conservative, tend to be much more likely to support comprehensive immigration reform, tend to be much more likely to support the idea of two individuals of the same gender being able to marry. And the reason for that is because they grew up in much more diverse communities and realizing that someone who comes from another part of the world or speaks a different language or has a different type of appearance or set of beliefs is not someone to be feared. But that's the kind of person with whom you can become friends. And I do think encouraging those sentiments, rather than making young children feel like they are responsible for atrocities that took place decades, if not centuries before they were born, is a smarter way of approaching this topic. But I recognize, as I said earlier, that there are two extremes, and ultimately the answer comes somewhere on that middle ground.
With kids struggling in reading and math proficiency, how much priority should CRT take in the curriculum when kids are failing so many other metrics?
Well, once again, I'll broaden the question. First of all, I think it's worth noting that critical race theory itself is not taught in elementary and secondary schools. That is a college postgraduate level discussion. Where the debate takes place is not over whether critical race theory should be taught or not, but rather whether it ought, to the degree it ought to impact what is taught in the public schools. So technically speaking, I don't know of a public school in California or elsewhere that is teaching critical race theory to elementary or secondary students, but the debate clearly impacts the way we teach our children. So do I think our children need to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, and should those be the basics of any good education? I do believe that, but I also believe that those core competencies need to be augmented by giving young people a broader understanding of the world in which they live. And so I believe not only that students should learn about race relations and discrimination, I believe that they should learn about music and art. I believe they ought to learn. I believe they ought to learn history. I believe they ought to learn poetry and literature. There's a famous scene in a wonderful movie that came out many years ago, and I think the movie was before your time, Jessica. But if you haven't seen it, I'd highly recommend it. It's a movie with Richard Dreyfuss called Mr. Holland's Opus, and Mr. Holland plays a high school music teacher. And late in his career, Richard Dreyfuss, the teacher, is arguing with the principal, a character played by William Macy. And Macy, the principal, is emphasizing reading and writing. He's cutting arts and music programs, and Dreyfuss is arguing against it. And William Macy says to Richard Dreyfuss, "We got to teach these kids to read and write." And Richard Dreyfuss says back to him, "What are we going to teach them to read and write about?" And so I do think teaching art, teaching music, teaching literature, teaching poetry, teaching race relations, teaching discrimination, teaching about how people of different backgrounds don't just fight and subjugate each other, but how they can work together, I think is a critically important part of an elementary and secondary education, if only so these kids have something to read and write and think about.
And I do remember that movie. I was taking sign language at the time. So at the end, when he says beautiful Cole, when he's singing to his son, like that's one of the moments from that movie that I remember better than everything. So it was a beautiful film.
Wow. All right, next week I'm gonna have to cite an even older movie to. So.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. All right. How do you distinguish between teaching critical race theory and honest history teaching?
Well, and this goes back to the conversation we were having in the first half of the program today. Once again, the question isn't whether or not to teach about racism and discrimination. The question isn't whether to teach about bad actions and ugly sentiments that people in this country have harbored over the centuries. The question is how much to teach it and how much you emphasize the flaws versus the more laudatory aspects of our history. And there is no absolutely perfect answer to that. I believe that on balance, our country has accomplished much more good than it has incurred harm. I recognize that there's people who disagree with that. And so the conversation to be had is how large a segment of our curriculum gets set aside to the ugly stuff and how much of it focuses on the more inspirational incidents. And I think if you want to if you want to move a society forward, if you want a country, a nation state, a community to not just survive, but to thrive, I think you have to give people some inspiration. You have to demonstrate examples of past successes. And there's no shortage of those in our country's past. But I also think it's important for us to learn from our mistakes. So while I'd make these questions part of the curriculum, again, not critical race theory itself, but the discussion of racism and discrimination that's influenced by critical race theory. Well, I think we do need to look at the less fortunate aspects of our society, if you want society and if you want the country to succeed, you do have to tell an inspirational story with flaws, as opposed to a much more derogatory narrative with occasional positives.
How do Black scholars and educators feel about critical race theory?
There is a pretty significant division within the academic community regarding critical race theory, and that division exists within scholars of all racial and ethnic groups, at least that I know of. Most of the leading proponents of critical race theory do happen to be academics of color, either African American or from other minority communities. But there are very strong divisions in this field, not just as to the validity of the theory, but as I talked about earlier, even more importantly, how it should impact what's being taught. I'm just fine with graduate students and professors arguing back and forth about whether this theory is valid or not. That's what higher education is for. But to me, the much more critical question is the extent to which it influences what's taught to the children in our public schools, in our elementary and middle and high schools. And on that question, I think the country is extremely divided. As I mentioned earlier, it's a debate we're going to have in unnecessarily and unfortunately heated terms for quite a while going forward.
Thank you. Sorry, the questions are coming in so quickly, it's hopping around. Would it be possible, actually you just kind of mentioned this, so I might move on to a different question, sorry. Why is it taking so long for the US government to give exit visas to Afghani interpreters, drivers, etc., and their families?
I don't know. And everyone that I've read within the mainstream discussion agrees that the US has an obligation to help the translators, the volunteers, the others in Afghanistan who helped the US as it tried to establish a more stable environment there, because these are people who are going to meet with some very serious and ugly retribution from the Taliban in all likelihood in the very near future. I don't see anyone arguing against this. The challenge, as near as I can tell, is a logistical one. To where should these individuals and families be moved? Yeah. How should it be accomplished? And the really scary thing is that while we're arguing about how best to save these people, we're leaving them in harm's way. And President Biden, in his remarks last Thursday, did make it clear that we owed a tremendous debt to these people and that he intended that our country would repay that debt. But we need to start moving on it more quickly, no question.
The Russians tried to control Afghanistan and quickly learned they could not control it. Why did it take the United States so long to realize that we could not win the war?
Well, why did it take the US so long? Why did it take Russia so long? Why did it take Alexander the Great so long? It is an incredibly divided country. It is incredibly difficult terrain. The area, calling it a country, implies a degree of stability which may or may not be deserved. But the region is renowned for its suspicion and its distaste for foreign occupiers of any type. I'm not a sufficient student of history to be able to talk about the previous empires that tried in Afghanistan and failed. But what I think happened for the US there, as I was talking about earlier, is once we arrived there and once it became clear that a US military and diplomatic presence could not create a stable Afghan government, incredible Afghan military, and viable Afghan society, even once that became clear, the counter pressure to provide safety, or at least provide support, to hope that the Afghan military could become better equipped and better prepared to defend their country. The pressures to provide safety and provide support for many years simply outnumbered the seemingly now obvious outcome that awaited us. When I was talking earlier, I made a point of criticizing both Bush and Obama, both Trump and Biden. Responsibility here is a bipartisan one. But I think one of the great challenges that a superpower faces, not just the US, but others, one of the great challenges that a superpower faces, and one of the real difficult things for a military organization is to admit defeat and admit retreat. The military is trained to have a can-do, get the job done attitude. So saying we can't get this done is just not part of the makeup of a way military is constructed. And 4 American presidents of both parties all felt to some degree or another that we had to get out. But all of them were concerned that leaving the country so unstable and so vulnerable, not just to Taliban, but to become a hotbed of terrorism again in the future, the way it was pre-September 11th, is just not something that we're willing to take on. It's not as if this snuck up on us. Bush and Obama and Trump and Biden all understood to some degree or other that this wasn't winnable. I think all understood also that letting Afghanistan return to what it had been on September 10th, 2001 was simply not an acceptable outcome. And what Biden is hoping, we'll see if him and his successors are successful, is whether air power, whether increased reach of technology, whether alliances in the region allow the United States, if not to be playing an active role in Afghanistan, at least to be able to monitor it closely enough to keep the resurgence of terrorism from turning the country into the kind of breeding ground it was pre-9/11.
Should it be the responsibility of the US to prevent civil war in Afghanistan? We've been training Afghan governments and military for decades. It doesn't seem to have worked. Would staying indefinitely make any sense?
Well, staying indefinitely, as we've talked about for a portion of the program already, was not tenable because it became clear that not only would the US not be able to establish a stable and viable Afghan government and military, but worse, given the agreement from 2 years ago, that if the US did not abide by the timeline for departure that was agreed on under the previous administration, the Taliban would have begun attacking not just Afghani interests, excuse me, but US interests as well. And given the number of US soldiers who have perished in Afghanistan over 20 years, both Trump and Biden ultimately decided that even if we do have some responsibility for completing the task that we took on back in 2001, knowing that we can't successfully accomplish it tells us that it's no longer worth the risk to American lives in order to stay to fight a battle that can't be won. So is it our job to keep Afghanistan from having a civil war? Technically, no, but playing no role in the region also, as we've learned from the past, creates all sorts of instability and a very hospitable environment in which bad actors can flourish. So the balance between an Afghanistan civil war and a global threat based in Afghanistan and the surrounding region makes the question that was just raised a little bit blurrier. We can't solve that civil war, but paying no attention to such a volatile region is a dangerous decision as well.
What can be done to protect women and girls from Taliban restrictions? Can the UN get involved?
The UN is really going to struggle once NATO and the US troops are gone. And although US and other Western leaders are talking a good game and suggesting that the Taliban may have learned some lessons over the years. Early appearances are that they are very intent on being just as repressive in their treatment of women, young girls, and others as they were before 2001. We don't have time today for a broader conversation on immigration policy, particularly refugee and asylum status. But I think ultimately it will be important for the US and our allies to find a way to increase the amount of refugee and asylum opportunities available for Afghanis so as to avoid the kind of subjugation of women and small children that the Taliban has imposed in the areas it's controlled in the past.
Thank you. I know we're getting close to the end of the hour. A couple more questions here. This one was coming in a lot. As of right now, who actually determines the curriculum for US history taught in American schools? We got asked by about 5 different people that question.
Well, because we are a federalist society, these are decisions for the most part that aren't made in Washington or even in state capitals. Now, state governments and state legislatures can have some influence, but ultimately these decisions are made on a school by school or school district by school district basis. And so while Congress or a state legislature can pass laws incentivizing certain types of teaching or making it much more difficult, it's very, very rare that they would actually overrule a local office holder, a school district, from teaching in the manner in which they choose. As some of you may know, there's been a very pronounced debate going on in California public schools recently about an ethnic studies curriculum. And the state legislature recently passed a bill signed by Governor Newsom that sets some parameters for what type of ethnic studies could be taught. But this is essentially a sample curriculum, a model curriculum. Ultimately, it's going to be up to schools and school districts to make these decisions for themselves. Can a legislature or a Congress absolutely forbid something from being taught, And the answer is yes, they can. But it's relatively rare and it's fairly difficult. So generally these decisions do tend to get made at the local and the district and the school level.
Thank you. And I think this will probably be our last question. What is your opinion of the Texas Democrats fleeing the state so that voting legislation can't be passed? If this could happen in California with Republicans fleeing the state, wouldn't Democrats be outraged?
Yeah, I think the questioner's instinct on this is the right one, which is, both parties engage in selective outrage over these types of activities. Texas Republicans think that voting rules aren't strict enough, and so they're trying to pass laws to address that. California Democrats thought that federal immigration law under Donald Trump was too strident, so they passed laws trying to address this. I don't know if in the long run, leaving the state does much to move the Democrats' increase the Democrats' chances on stopping legislation from passing. But their goal is to simply call public attention to what they view as the great importance of expanding voting opportunities. And so they think that going to Washington will help them do that. The challenge on this issue, and Jessica, it's one we probably ought to come back to in the weeks ahead, the whole question of voting rights, is there are a lot of stirring speeches being given at every level, from President Biden to members of Congress to Democratic members of the Texas state legislature. But as long as Democrats are not united on this issue enough to be willing to suspend or overturn the filibuster, there's not really much practical impact to this argument. So ultimately, Texas is going to pass this bill. And the Democratic legislators who left the state to go to Washington have delayed the inevitable, but they haven't stopped it. The question going forward is whether they've raised awareness of this issue to a sufficient degree to change the overall political debate over voting rights. And I don't think the answer is yes, but it's one of those many questions that we'll watch evolve as we go forward together.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you to our audience. I know we had way more questions than we could have ever squeezed probably into the next 2 or 3 hours. So I apologize if I didn't get to your question, but hopefully you can join us next week and I will look out for yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Jessica, thank you again. You handled the questions so beautifully. Dan, this was such an exceptional discussion. Thank you for leading it. And I particularly enjoy your historical perspectives on both topics that help give us such a broader understanding. So thank you for all of that knowledge.
Well, thank you, Kim. Fascinating as always. And for those who tuned in to hear about COVID, I promise we'll have plenty to talk about on that front next Tuesday too.
Well, we have you next Tuesday with us with Politics in the Time of Coronavirus at 11 o'clock. But we also have some other terrific programs I just want to quickly let our audience know about. On the 16th, we have a member screening, Enemies of the State. We also have a member-led discussion, how global cities are confronting homelessness. We also have a program on July 29th, Reimagining Healthcare in Our Post-Pandemic World. And remember, you can access all of our live streams from the past on our website. So if you're traveling or on vacation, you don't miss a thing. It's always there on our website for you. So please go to the website, register for upcoming events, see past events, become a member, make a donation. We appreciate everything that you do. And Dan, can't wait to see you again next Tuesday.
Thank you, Kim. I'm already looking forward to it too.